Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the flagship Global Status of CCS 2020 report. My name is Guloren Turan, and I'm the General Manager of Advocacy at the Global CCS Institute. The status report, authored by the Institute, provides a comprehensive update of overview and progress of CCS carbon capture and storage developments around the world. And today, Jeff Erikson, the Institute's General Manager of Client Engagement, and I will provide you with a snapshot of the key findings from the report. The report is now available and free for you to download on our website at www.globalccsinstitute.com. But before we get started, if you're on social media, we encourage you to join us, our online discussions as we live tweet. Follow us on Twitter at Global CCS, and please use the hashtag #DataCCS2020 to chime in. We will have several speakers joining us today, including a panel of industry experts. And we will have a brief Q&A session following our presentation. So I encourage you to log your questions through the GoToWebinar control panel throughout the way. But before we kick off today's report launch, joining us, we feel very privileged to have the Minister of Petroleum and Energy from Norway, Ms. Tina Bru, joining us to provide the keynote remarks. Norway has been a long-time leader in CCS development, having been storing CO2 underground since 1996. The country made headlines earlier this year when the government gave green light to the Landscape project, committing to invest 1.5 billion euros into it. And it's a hub and cluster initiative that will have enough storage capacity to receive and store captured CO2 from across Europe. To speak now about this key climate technology, we have Minister Bru. Minister Bru.
Dear everyone, and dear good friends of CCS around the globe. It is a great pleasure for me to speak to you today, even though it is through a camera. I hope my message finds you well. I'm glad I have the opportunity to share with you our aspirations and perspectives on full-scale CCS. The report being launched today shows that there is a boost in enthusiasm for CCS projects globally, and that the number of projects have increased sharply in the last few years. Norway has great belief in CCS, and we want to see it succeed. It is an important and efficient tool for mitigating climate change. Furthermore, it is important for me to underscore that we have a long and positive experience with CCS here in Norway. CO2 has been captured and stored on the Norwegian continental shelf since 1996 in connection with our oil and gas industry. And many industry leaders and key politicians I speak to, they tell me that the public support and the increased understanding of CCS and its role in reducing emissions is driving this technology forward. I share their views. And I believe we are now moving this issue forward in a very positive way. And in September, we launched a full-scale industrial CCS project here in Norway, the largest in our history. We have, for the last 6 years, developed a project that will demonstrate a complete chain of carbon capture, transport, and storage. One of the first in the world to scale up this type of flexible solution. And the Norwegian government recently proposed funding for the implementation of this project, named Longship. And the name is a nod to our Viking heritage, as the longships of the day were innovative and, of course, modern. And they brought us out into the world. And we hope that we will be able to bring this new, complete, and flexible solution out to the world as well. And with that, enable more CCS solutions to be viable. Longship involves CO2 capture from industrial sources, where liquid CO2 will be transported by ship to a terminal on the west coast of Norway. From there, CO2 will be pumped through pipelines to a reservoir 2,600 meters beneath the seafloor in the North Sea. and we propose to first implement CO2 capture at a cement factory at Breivik. In addition, we also propose to partially fund CO2 capture at a waste-to-energy facility in Oslo. But I invite others to invest with us to develop this climate technology further. The storage infrastructure in Longship is designed with excess capacity to enable storage of CO2 from other CO2 sources. We believe this will lower the hurdle for the realization of other projects. Because if we are to consider this project a success, it will rely on the development of new projects that can benefit from technology transfer and use of shared infrastructure. This project must not be the first and only, it must be the first of many. And Longship is a milestone in the Norwegian government's industry and climate efforts. It will lead to emission cuts in Norway, and it will facilitate the development of new technology, and thus also, of course, new jobs. In several energy-intensive industries, such as production of cement, metals, and waste-to-energy, there are currently no other methods to cut all the CO2 emissions. With the knowledge currently available, CCS will be necessary on a large scale if we are to meet the climate targets at an acceptable cost. CCS technology will also be decisive to achieve carbon-negative solutions in the second half of this century. Let me also shortly address how CCS fits in with goals and aspirations for the COP26. Our main priority for COP26 should be to finalize the Article 6 negotiations and catching up on many unresolved issues due to the cancelled meetings this year. While being a firm supporter of CCS, I believe that the COP should focus on general emission reductions and adaptations, not on individual technologies. But it is clear that CCS is necessary for reaching the balance between emissions and removals by sinks, as agreed in the Paris Agreement. When submitting our enhanced climate target, we included CCS. I hope many countries will do the same. The annual reports from the Global CCS Institute provide an excellent update for the deployment of CCS. Thank you for preparing it, because it gives insights and it demonstrates that CCS is becoming a mainstay of the global climate efforts. And we need to speak up about CCS. We need to share the good examples of CCS, and we need to be advocates for this solution. And I believe we need to make it a success together. Thank you so much for your attention.
I thank Minister Bru for these words and insights. Indeed, Norway has seen much CCS progress over the past year, as has many other parts of the world. Jeff and I are excited to walk you through the findings of this year's status report, giving a global overview of CCS developments. In 2020, the pipeline of CCS facilities, both operational and under development, continued to grow for the third year in a row. 2020 was undoubtedly a very challenging year because of the pandemic and the economic impact that it caused. However, from a climate point of view, it was a year of building back better. The number of countries, cities, and companies committing to net zero targets continued to grow. And there was also increasing recognition that meeting net zero emissions target without CCS is going to be extremely challenging, if not outright impossible. As a result, government support for CCS, both in terms of policy and funding, continued to grow. And indeed, CCS was part of a number of recovery packages. The US, UK, Norway, EU, Japan, and Australia are notable in this regard, and Jeff will talk a little bit more in detail about them in a few minutes. In addition to the net zero targets, we saw three key factors enhancing the business case for CCS and helping accelerate its deployment around the world. Firstly, enhanced tax credits in the US, otherwise known as 45Q. The US is without a doubt the leader in the CCS scoreboard. It has the largest number of CCS facilities, both in operation and under development, as well as 12 of the 17 totally new facilities added to the pipeline last year are located in the US. This is in large part due to the very supportive policy environment for CCS in the US, the 45Q tax credit, the federal tax credit, but also because of the supportive policies at the state level, for example, in California, the low carbon fuel standard. Secondly, we're seeing hub and clusters emerging quickly as the favorite business model for CCS. Hub and clusters help reduce risk, they help reduce costs, and facilitate regional industrial decarbonization. As a result, we observe that governments, project sponsors, banks, and local communities all alike like them. Thirdly, hydrogen. Hydrogen has long been called the fuel of the future, but that future is increasingly becoming very imminent. Using CCS to produce low carbon clean hydrogen currently is the lowest cost option for producing low carbon hydrogen, and we expect it to remain so in locations in particular where there isn't an abundance of renewable electricity, or where we expect the fossil fuel prices to continue to be low. However, despite this progress in 2020 and the good news, we should not lose sight of the fact that this is nowhere near enough. And if we are to reach net zero targets, CCS, we need to scale up the CCS capacity by more than 100-fold in the next 30 years. This is undoubtedly a huge challenge, but nevertheless one that we must face. And as the Institute, we think that it's not insurmountable. In 2020, we introduced a new system of classifying CCS facilities. In the past, we used to focus on the capture capacity to differentiate between what we call large-scale facilities and what we call pilot and demo facilities. This system of classification became less useful, particularly over the last year, as hub and cluster development started to take off, because hub and clusters offer shared transport and storage infrastructure, and thus enable smaller sources of CO2, emission sources of CO2, to become commercially viable. As such, our new classification system categorizes facilities either as commercial or as pilot and demonstration. Based on this system, there are a total of 65 commercial facilities in various different stages in the pipeline. Of these, there are 26 facilities that are currently operating today. There are 2 facilities that have suspended operations. These are Petronova and Lost Cabin, 3 commercial facilities under construction, and 34 in various different stages of development. All the facilities, the total pipeline of 65 facilities, have a cumulative maximum capture and storage capacity of around 115 million tons of CO2 per annum. And last year, in 2020, almost 40 million tons of CO2 was captured and stored from the 26 facilities in operation. Here is a map of all CCS facilities, both commercial and demo facilities around the world, showing where the concentration of CCS activity is. And Jeff will shortly discuss the developments in the Americas, in Europe, in JCC and APAC regions. And here is a bar chart of the CCS pipeline development historically. As you can see, in the earlier years of the decade, there was a fair bit of attrition, project attrition, but the pipeline has been growing for the 3rd year in a row now, and almost doubling in capacity since 2017. And capacity-wise, there has been a 33%, a third increase year on year since 2019. Here is a bubble chart of CCS facilities across different applications of CCS. This chart shows facilities that are either operational, in operations, suspended operations, or in advanced stages of development, and therefore it does not include those facilities that are in early stages that have been recently added to the pipeline. On the y-axis of the chart, we have the different applications of CCS. On the x-axis, we have the years. and the size of the bubble shows the capture capacity of the plant in question. There are a few things I want to point out about this chart. Firstly, the y-axis, and I'd like to draw your attention to the diversity of applications. These range from heavy industries such as cement and steel production to power generation, gas, coal, waste to energy, hydrogen, natural gas processing, and we haven't even plotted carbon dioxide removal technologies, direct air capture and BECCS on this chart. This is underlining the versatility of CCS as a climate mitigation technology. Secondly, when we look at the historic evolution, we see that the early facilities concentrated almost entirely on gas processing, fertilizer and chemical production and ethanol production. But now looking forwards, we're seeing a much bigger diversity of applications, and we're looking forward to having the first cement plant, the first waste to energy plant, and the first natural gas power plant with CCS online. And the third final point I want to make is that you can see the big increase in the number of power facilities, both coal and gas-fired power facilities with CCS in development. This is predominantly a US phenomenon, but I've also mentioned that there are a number of earlier stage CCS plants with on gas-fired generation that are in planning in the UK. Early developments of CCS adopted mostly a point-to-point model, where a single source, a large emission source, was connected through a dedicated pipeline to a dedicated storage site. However, like most industries, CCS benefits from economies of scale, and therefore hubs and clusters are quickly becoming as the preferred business model. Hubs and clusters involve connecting multiple emission sources through a shared transport infrastructure to a shared storage facility. This is a preferred business model because it reduces interdependency risk between the different parties. It enables the different parties to concentrate on what they do best within the chain, i.e. be it storage or be it capture. And hubs and clusters enable scaling up of capacity of the infrastructure and thus lead to lower unit costs as well. On this slide, on the right-hand side, you can see a map of the Langskip project that Minister Bru talked about in Norway. It's one of the most advanced hubs in development, and its transport and storage infrastructure is often referred to, you may have heard, as often being referred to as Northern Lights. It initially aims to capture, again, as Minister said, CO2 from a cement and a waste to energy plant in Norway, but it's being scaled up to store emissions from across Europe. And this map shows the potential emission sources, the candidate emission sources that are contemplating sending their emissions, CO2 emissions, to Northern Lights. And as you can see, there's a impressive number of CO2 sources that are candidates for this across Europe. And this is a map of hub and clusters in existence or under development. There's at least a dozen hub and clusters under development around the world, which you can read more about in the report. And with that, I would like to turn over to Jeff for him to give the regional highlights. Jeff.
Great, thank you very much, Guloren. As we look around the world at the various regions, there's one theme that resonates across all of them, and that is momentum. We see both public sector and private sector support for and investment in CCS growing in every region. And let me start with the Americas region. We added 12 new CCS facilities to our database from the Americas region, all of which are in the United States. That brings the total in the region to 36 facilities that are operating or in the development stage, plus 2 that are currently idled. That's more than half of the global total. In the US, the big news of 2020 was the finalization of the rules around the 45Q tax credit. 45Q and the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard have driven a great deal of interest, making the business case feasible for many new projects. And the US Department of Energy continues to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in co-funding support to get potential projects through the early stages of development. The CCS projects in development in the US are quite diverse, with new projects in cement, waste to energy, ethanol, chemical production, and coal and gas-fired power. In Canada, the big news of 2020 was the commencement of the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. The ACTL is another hub and cluster project with 2 CO2 emission sources, a refinery and a fertilizer plant to start, and room for many more industrial facilities to eventually link into the ACTL pipeline. This project is a great example of a public-private partnership with the Albertan and Canadian governments providing substantial funding and the private sector assuming the operational and commercial risks. It's also a great opportunity, a great example of the long-term vision of the province as it sees the development of a low-carbon industrial corridor as an important part of its future. And in the Santos Basin offshore Brazil, Petrobras continues to quietly rack up their CO2 storage total, which is now over 14 million tons since the project commenced in 2013. Moving to Europe, we are seeing CCS momentum across the continent. 14 facilities are in operation or development, and nearly all of them reflect the hub and cluster operating model. Notably, many are centered around ports, which have a high density of emission sources and an infrastructure and property ownership model that supports hub and cluster development. CCS has moved beyond the big 3 of Norway, the UK, and the Netherlands, and there are now projects being developed in numerous countries, including Denmark, Sweden, Italy, and others. The European Union has put out a first call for projects under the Innovation Fund, which is expected to be a major source of CCS funding going forward. The UK has recently committed to have 2 CCS industrial clusters in operation by 2025 and 2 more by 2030, with £1 billion in funding to enable that. And the Norwegian government, as you've heard, has now moved ahead to fund its Langskip project, the project that Minister Brew and Guloren mentioned in their remarks. While many of these projects have been under consideration for some time, the fact that transboundary shipment of CO2 is now allowed under the London Protocol, another significant development in 2020, has reduced risk and opened up commercial opportunities for these projects. And now on to the Asia Pacific region. We're seeing the emergence of a potential CCS powerhouse in the region. There are currently 2 operating CCS facilities, 1 in China, 1 in Australia, and another 8 in development. There are also numerous pilot projects spanning natural gas processing, fertilizer production, hydrogen production, waste to energy, iron and steel, coal to chemicals, and cement. The model that is developing in this region is collaboration between governments, where, for example, one country has high emissions and a strong reduction commitment, and the other has ample storage resources and know-how. Japan, for example, is driving international activities to develop clean hydrogen production using CCS. Several countries in the region have emerging CCS strategies, and the Australian government now has a $50 million fund to support CCS development through the early stages of projects. And China has announced a commitment to net zero emissions by 2060 and is currently working on its 14th 5-year plan, and CCS is likely to be part of the recommended actions. Moving finally to the Gulf region, this is an area of great potential for CCS and one in which the region's ability to adapt to a low carbon future has great implications for their economies. This region has operating CCS facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, and features the only operating CCS facility on a steel plant, the El Riyadh project in Abu Dhabi, run by ADNOC. Saudi Arabia is promoting a circular carbon economy model as a holistic approach to climate mitigation. The model includes 4 elements: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. And CCS is an important part of their path to net zero emissions. There's a huge storage potential in the region, as you can imagine from the fact that billions of barrels of oil and gas have been naturally stored in the geologic structure for millions of years. The 2 biggest emitters in the region, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are also those countries that have taken a strong lead on CCS. So in summary, what we're seeing around the world is a recognition that CCS is vital to a net zero emissions future, and that its versatility enables progress in 4 ways: achieving deep decarbonization in hard to abate industries, enabling the production of low carbon hydrogen at scale, providing low carbon dispatchable power, and delivering negative emissions. That said, if the world is to achieve climate stabilization and net zero emissions, a massive scale up of CCS is required. We need to move from 20 some operating CCS facilities in 2020 to more than 2,000 CCS facilities by mid-century. To get there, policy is required to provide the right incentives. Those policies need to create conditions for investment, facilitate the development of CO2 infrastructure, and clarify key legal and regulatory issues. So there's a lot to be excited about, but there's a lot more to do if CCS is to contribute meaningfully to get us back, to get us on track to a net zero future. And with that, let me invite Guloren back in, and she and I will be fielding questions. Jamie Burrows, our client engagement manager based in London, will be facilitating the Q&A. Hi, Jamie.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for the questions that you've been submitting as Guloren and Jeff have been presenting. We've received many questions, so I may group some of these questions together to address as many as possible in the time allocated. We've received a number of questions about capture costs. One, for example, could you please give us more colors about the cost decline of carbon capture and other areas such as usage? So could you tell us a little bit more about capture costs and their decline, please?
I may perhaps start on that. So when we talk about CCS costs, one thing that we should bear in mind is that there is not one cost. If you remember back the bubble chart that I showed, there are diverse and there are a number of diverse applications of CCS, and the cost of CCS very much depends on the application, depending on the concentration of CO2 in the stream, depending on the pressure, etc. Therefore, the cost varies from, say, $20 a ton, roughly, give or take, for gas processing to perhaps $100 a ton for heavy industry, for example, cement. And when we start talking about technologies like direct air capture, the cost is even higher in the $200 to $300 a ton range. Having said this, one thing that is common across the various different applications is that costs come down through deployment. And the more we scale up, we expect to see the costs come down even further. And we have examples of this. For example, in power generation, the first power plant with CCS was Boundary Dam. The cost came in around $110 a ton. And then for Petronova, the cost was down at the second of a kind, from the first of a kind to the second of a kind, that came down to $65 a ton. And based on some of the feed assessments and studies that are done for the plants in development, we understand that the costs for similar plants are expected to be around $45 a ton or so. And the third thing I would like to mention is, of course, innovation. So as maybe new breakthrough developments, technologies are brought to market, and I'm thinking, for example, the LM cycle, as these are become commercial, there's also potential to bring down costs even further. Jeff?
And Jamie, yeah, if I can, let me just add to what Guloren said. You know, there's a lot of focus on cost, and that's an important piece of the business case for CCS, but it's not the only piece. And the other element of that business case is value. And so while costs are important, so is the value that CCS provides both to countries and to companies, particularly those that have made dramatic reduction commitments over the longer term. So CCS certainly will enable those countries and companies to achieve those long-term net zero emission goals. They sustain industries, they provide employment opportunities, they provide a brand value as well. So in addition to the cost coming down, we're seeing also the value of CCS increasing at the same time.
Great. Thank you. We've received several questions in relation to utilization. So why would we store CO2 when it could be converted into new products?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start with that. And I think the answer is that this is not an either or. Utilization, carbon utilization and carbon storage need to happen in parallel with each other, both moving forward to increase the amount of emissions that they're sequestering. But I think certainly in the next decade or two, the benefit to storage and the need for storage is because it provides scale. While there are a lot of great utilization opportunities, and many of those provide a revenue source for those companies, what the world needs now is scale. Over the next two decades, we need a lot of CO2 to be pulled out of the atmosphere or prevented from getting into the atmosphere. And that's the advantage that storage has, certainly in the near term, midterm, over utilization. We certainly support utilization of the products, utilization of CO2 in products. We hope and expect that market to continue to grow. And as it does, it's going to continue to be complementary to the storage element.
Just one minor point to add to what Jeff said, which I agree with completely. We support storage as long as, of course, storage is permanent in the product and is not released back into the atmosphere. And I think permanence is a very important factor of geological storage as well. There's no, as Jeff said, we need both, but there's no walking away from the fact that we'll need a lot of geological storage to meet our climate targets.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've had some questions around storage methods. How many projects are storing geologically and how many store through enhanced oil recovery?
I think from the top of my head, 5 projects are storing CO2 through dedicated storage, and the rest of, I'm talking about the projects that are in operation, the remainder are storing through enhanced oil recovery. When we look at the new projects, new facilities that are added to our pipeline, and I remember this particularly for the US, which is, as we discussed, 12 of the 17 new facilities, because I looked at it this morning, I know that at least half of them are considering dedicated geological storage. So that seems to be certainly kind of increasingly getting more attention and potential going forward.
Great.
Yeah, in the US, in the early days, again, EOR was an important part of the business case. It was actually, well before we started seeing CCS as a key contributor to a climate change solution. So there was a lot of knowledge and experience that was built on the back of enhanced oil recovery. And while that continues to be an important part of the business case in many parts of the world, as Guloren said, there is a movement towards dedicated storage as a preferred alternative in many places.
Great, and I have a question here which is probably best given towards yourself, Jeff. Why hasn't the US adopted the hub and cluster model?
Oh, I could go back to our culture of independence, but I think it's actually, it's probably because historically the projects that have been under development have been either vertically integrated, so the same company is capturing the CO2 as is using the CO2, and so it made sense to have one source, a pipeline, and one storage hub. But what we are seeing actually is a movement in that direction. And there's a couple of projects that are in development now, one in particular on the Gulf Coast that's employing the hub and cluster model. And I think we'll see more and more of that. Some of that is enabled actually by the work that the Department of Energy has done through their Carbon Safe program to prove out storage capabilities. The intention there is to develop these regional storage hubs which can be supplied by CO2 from multiple sources.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question here, renewable costs are dropping. Do we need CCS?
Yes, we do. We need renewables, a lot of them as well. It's not a case of either or, it's a case of and. We need CCS in addition, renewables, of course, particularly are relevant for power generation, but in addition to power generation, we need CCS to decarbonize industry. We need CCS to remove CO2 from the atmosphere through direct air capture and BECCS. We need CCS to produce clean hydrogen, and even in power generation, gas and sort of fossil-based fuel, fossil fuel power plants with CCS can provide flexible, dispatchable, low-carbon power, thereby helping to with the grid stability. So CCS has a number of applications, a number of roles to play, but it's not a case of either or. Need renewable CCS, energy efficiency. That's something that we as the institutes have been saying for a number of years, and so are other organizations like IEA. So it's very much a case of and.
Great. So there's a question here about public perception. Given that the costs of CCS may ultimately be borne by the public through taxes or increased costs, public acceptance of CCS is important. What are your views on the current degree of public acceptance for CCS, and how does this differ across regions?
I can start with that. You know, I used the word momentum when I was talking about what's happening with projects around the world, and I think that's the case as well for public acceptance. The concerns that are raised around CCS, many of them are absolutely relevant and important. The issue of permanence is quite important. You know, the question about whether this is a reason or excuse to continue to emit is an important question. What we're seeing, though, is that, and I'll say in the US, you know, CCS is one of the few issues currently that has strong bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans in Congress in particular, but also you see that also in the States. We're also seeing many environmental NGOs that are becoming stronger and louder supporters of CCS, mainly because of the math, right? They see that we can't achieve a stable climate and net zero emissions without CCS playing an important role there. So I think as folks become more informed about the role for CCS, the essentiality, and what the actual risks are and what the risks aren't, I think we'll continue to see growing support, but we still have, I'll say, a lot of work to do. There needs to be continued dialogue to continue to build that support, as we've seen in other industries.
And just, I mean, again, kind of very much echoing, what Jeff said. I was going to say that I like the phrase succeeds breeds, or nothing succeeds like success, because in places where there has been successful CCS development, we also see a lot of support for CCS as well, generally speaking. I know, for example, we heard from Minister Bru, but I spoke in Trondheim a year or some 18 months ago at a university event, and the support for CCS from the university students was really impressive. I mean, we have a country where this has been done successfully and safely, as I said, since 1996. So the support is very palpable. And for example, the US as well. In perhaps parts of the world where it's new, there is, as Jeff said, likely to be perhaps a bit more sort of questions in people's minds. And it's important that the public, the government and the private industry work hand in hand in order to be transparent and raise the level of awareness and knowledge about CCS.
Great, thank you. We've received several questions about the deployment of CCS in developing countries. So, for example, will CCUS projects be feasible in Africa or developing countries? I wonder if you could share your views around that.
Well, I'll begin with that, and again, invite Guloren to provide her view. There are some countries that are seeing significant opportunity, and I'm thinking in particular in Southeast Asia. They see both an opportunity based on their geology, and I mentioned international collaboration in Southeast Asia, and you are seeing that kind of partnering among those that have good geology and those that have high emissions. So I think that's an opportunity for them. I think it will continue to be a challenge for developing countries to prioritize public funding for CCS when they've got other social needs that are quite dire. And so that implies a different business model than full, national government funding. But certainly the interest is there, and certainly the need is there.
Not a lot to add to Jeff, only to point out that mobilizing finance, of course, is going to be critical. Mobilizing international finance is going to be critical. And in that regard, we're yet to see kind of the replacement of the Clean Development Mechanism, Article 6, etc. Some of these developments and what comes out of COP26, I think, are going to be quite important for the development and deployment of CCS in the non-OECD countries.
Great, thank you. The last question here. I still hear commentators state that CCS is an unproven technology. Why do you think that is, and what can we do about it?
Well, I guess it's probably, I'll just start, it's probably because a lot of people don't see a CCS facility on their rooftops, or they're not driving through the countryside seeing, wind turbines. CCS is a big capex, big industrial sort of scale project, or has been. So I think people are not necessarily aware of how many CCS facilities there are around the world. We've been doing sort of sequestration since the 1970s in North America. We heard from Minister Burrows that Norway has been doing it, geological storage, since 1996. So I would call that actually, it's a proven technology. There are certain applications which we discussed which are going to be sort of new, but the fundamental technology is proven. So, and I think it's through events, webinars like these, through our report, through other reports from other organizations like the IEA and others. I think we just need to work at chipping away that perception. Don't know, Jeff, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, it's a question of why is the perception there. I think it is, certainly a misperception. It's been 100 years since we've learned how to separate CO2 from other gases. So the elements are there, and I think all of us that are CCS proponents just need to do a better job of engaging, of listening, of talking, of communicating, talking about the alternatives, talking about the progress that we've made and the progress that we still make. So, and Guloren's right that if it's not visible, it's not top of mind. And we see wind turbines every day, we see solar panels every day. To show a CCS project is a bit more difficult. And I think that's part of the challenge that we all have in communicating this.
Great. Well, thank you. We've had lots of questions. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but certainly to our audience, if you do have further questions around CCS, please do feel free to reach out to the Institute with them. We are here to help to address those questions. Jeff, Guloren, thank you so much for answering those questions, and thank you for your presentation. We will now move on to the panel discussion. As Jeff mentioned, I'm Jamie Burrows. I'm Client Engagement Manager at the Global CCS Institute, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I am delighted to be joined by a panel of international speakers, all of whom are helping to build the CCS industry of tomorrow. So, Jamie Gentoso is the Chief Executive Officer of LafargeHolcim US Cement. Ms. Gentoso is responsible for all cement production lines, overseeing an organization of approximately 3,200 employees, 13 cement and grinding plants, and more than 100 cement terminals. Jamie's joining us from New Jersey today. Welcome, Jamie. Zoe Knight is the Managing Director and Group Head of HSBC's Center of Sustainable Finance. Zoe set up and leads the center, which is a global think tank finding real economy and finance solutions for sustainability challenges, particularly in the climate change space. Zoe is joining us from London today. Welcome, Zoe. Torbjørg Fossum is Vice President of Global CCS Solutions at Equinor. Torbjørg leads Equinor's carbon capture and storage strategy and is asset owner for Equinor's carbon capture and storage projects, including the Northern Lights project in Norway, which was mentioned earlier. Torbjørg is joining us from Stavanger in Norway today. Welcome, Torbjørg.
Thank you.
Finally, Vianney de Buchet is Vice President of Energy Transition Europe at Liquide. Vianney leads Liquide's business development activities on energy transition across the region. So Vianney is joining us from Brussels today. Welcome, Vianney. Excellent. Thank you all for joining us for today's panel discussion. So, as Jeff and Guloren outlined in their presentation, 2020 has been a year in which CCS has gained significant momentum. We've seen a number of big steps forward. So to begin, I'd like to ask you to briefly outline your organization's near-term CCS activities and projects. And I'll perhaps ask Jamie to kick off, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate being a part of this panel and the discussion. It's quite interesting to see what's happening across the world, not just here in the US. So LafargeHolcim is the world's largest producer of cement. And globally, cement is responsible for 7 to 8% of the world's CO2 production. Here in the US, only 1 to 2%. And we are in a hard-to-abate sector. That's why we feel we have to play a key role toward decarbonization and the development of CCS. So we're partnering with like-minded organizations to scale up our impact. And across the globe, we have more than 20 projects with CCS going on right now throughout mostly Europe as well as North America. And here in the US, we have a couple different projects going on. One of the most exciting ones is a consortium with Savante, Total, and Oxy, where we will capture more than 2 million tons annually of CO2. That project has now been in process for over a year. We're through the feasibility study, and we've just been granted a DOE grant to move forward with engineering on it. So quite exciting for us, and we hope to see within the next 3 to 4 years the actual carbon capture unit in place on the cement plant. We're also working on a little smaller scale, actually with our friends at Liquide on a carbon capture unit at our plant in Whitehall. And I'll get into that a little bit later as to why it's completely necessary. But we think partnerships in all of this are going to play a key role because still, we talked about it a little earlier, we need to be able to do it at scale and also economically, but we also have to find places to put the CO2 and products to use them in. So I think we're at the beginning of a cusp of a great revolution in carbon capture.
That's great. Thank you, Jamie. Let's move across to Torbjørg now. Can you tell us a little bit more about Equinor's current CCS activities? Lots going on.
Yes, thank you. And I also appreciate the invitation to the panel. I have to, of course, start with Longship that we heard from Tina Bru as well. It has been quite a few important milestones this year. And we are developing this CO2 transport and storage part of this, I have to say, fantastic project together with Shell and Total. And really, it is the transport and storage part that we call Northern Lights. So it's a ship solution that can really gather CO2 from ports all over Europe. So with that, we can offer a CO2 transport and storage service to industry that want to decarbonize. And this year, we've drilled a well, we've confirmed a good storage. Industries have made investment decisions, and we are now waiting, as Tina Bru said, on the Parliament's investment decision by the end of this year. So a great year. I think we can allow ourselves to be optimistic when it comes to the Parliament decision. And the very, interesting part with Northern Lights is that it has created a tremendous industry in Europe that wants to decarbonize. So we are in dialogue with more than 50 industries that are looking into Northern Lights transport and storage service. And if you aggregate all those volumes on top of the other, those customers, potential customers, you will get to 50 million tons a year. So that is really 10 times higher than the capacity of the pipeline from the receiving facility to the injection template. So we really support what you also observe, that there is a moment of change for CCS. That's something we observe through Northern Lights. I would also like to mention, go from Norway to UK. We have lately taken an ownership in the Endurance CO2 storage offshore UK. We are license holder together with BP and National Grid, and we are also part of what we call the Northern Endurance Partnership. And this project is about storing CO2 from the industrial clusters, Humber and Teesside. And these two clusters, they stand for more than 50% of the industrial emissions in UK. We are very pleased to see the recent 10-point plan from UK government as well. And we actually believe that these projects that we are part of are able to deliver on the government's ambition of storing 10 million tons a year by 2030, and also then to deliver net zero clusters by 2040. So that was at least some of the important near-term activities from Equinor.
Absolutely, and there's further information around the Northern Endurance Partnership and some of the projects in the Global Status Report itself. Torbjørg, can I ask, when, all being well, when do you expect the Northern Lights facility to be operational?
2024, Q1 2024.
Excellent, exciting times. Thank you very much. Okay, Vianney, can you tell us a little more about Air Liquide's CCS activities, please?
Yes, good afternoon to everybody from Brussels. Jeff was mentioning momentum for CCS this year, and I think we really subscribe to this, but we would maybe say turning point. I think we really have the feeling that we are at a turning point. So many decisions, groundbreaking decisions, need to be taken in the next 12 months from government, from industry, from policymakers. We feel that this is a critical moment. Maybe if we want to make it in other words, it's a little bit we make it or we break it. So many things are underway, and at Air Liquide we've been very active on all those topics for many years, and we see ourselves as well in really at the turning point, preparing ourselves for decisions. So feasibility studies is behind us, pre-FEED is behind, FEED is engaged, and we are looking for FID, subject to a number of conditions, of course, in particular on several projects in CCS in Europe that are mostly related to our hydrogen activity. And we'll come back on this. But we are been very active with Portos since many years. We've been very active, and here this is a hub cluster concept as well. We've been very active in Antwerp, in the port of Antwerp, with a consortium that is quite large, that is called Antwerp at Sea, and we are one of the founding members, a leading actor of that consortium with others. Back last year, we signed in Oslo NDA with Northern Lights, and have been engaged with many different storage providers. So I think now this is the time. This is the time to take decision. We hope to be able to take them. There are still a couple of things to arrange, as you can imagine, and to fix. But yeah, that's a little bit our mood to make it happen.
Excellent. So
Yeah.
again, it sounds as though there are projects in the background poised to move ahead, subject to the correct policy conditions as such.
Yes, of course, those are not easy projects. I think we are all working on them for many years, many stakeholders with a lot of passions and passion as well. We have to recognize that this is not an easy topic. It's not an easy decision for first movers, but we have to take our responsibility as well with others. And for us, CCS, I would say, point out in two directions. First is to, I would say, for our own assets to decarbonize and enter into a world of low carbon hydrogen, as have been rightly emphasized at the beginning of the webinar. It's a priority. It's a priority, of course, for us, as hydrogen is one of our core activity, but it's a priority for Europe. Liquide has been very engaged and very instrumental in an early believer, probably, in the hydrogen world through the engagement in the Hydrogen Council. Probably some of these intuitions are becoming true now, and this was not obvious 2 or 3 years ago, even. So CCS is one way to get there, and also through our, I would say, engineering arm at Air Liquide, we have developed, how can I say, cutting-the-edge technologies throughout the chain that are related to capture or that are related to CO2 liquefaction. We are also engaged in a consortium for CO2 shipping through CO2 laws. So it's important, we all recognize that significant improvements have to be done throughout the chain. And some of the technologies that we have developed for years to capture CO2 and hydrogen, we found out through exchanges with other industries, in the cement industries, in the steel industry, even in the refining industry recently, that those new technologies, by adapting them to this new environment, can also deliver breakthrough efficiency. So one of the, I would say, leading product is called CryoCap, which is a capture technology that does not use steam, but that is based on electricity, so that it's a perfect fit for, I would say, a long-term electrification of the industry. So if you combine a capture with renewable energy, in the end, you really have an efficient tool or technology for the energy transition. So those technologies are available for third parties, of course, and for ourselves.
That's great. I'd like to bring Zoe Knight in at this point. We've heard a lot about different projects, different potential applications of CCS. How is the finance community starting to become involved in CCS projects, Zoe?
Thanks, Jamie. And again, echoing my fellow panelists, delighted to be here. And it's a shame, obviously, that we're not seeing each other in person, but it's great that we've got so many diverse countries and people represented today, so that's fantastic. Yeah, some of you may be thinking, why is the finance person on the panel with this CCS conversation? But the truth is, momentum's not only increasing in the CCS industry, momentum's increasing across finance to understand how a decarbonisation strategy is going to play out across different industries. And we're trying to get better at financing the change. So coming back to the questions here, the scale of the problem is to reduce emissions by 55% over the next 10 years. That's why we need to be firing on all cylinders to actually mobilise both private capital and public funding for a whole range of activities that are going to get us to that net zero point. So the finance community has been fantastic at labelling green products, and we know a lot about what the pure green activities are. What we're not quite so good at is knowing exactly how CCS fits into the mix as being a decarbonisation solution. And so the history around climate change thinking and mitigation has led to many investors being slightly old-fashioned in the way that they think about it, in applying it to power, and not really thinking about the application in industry as a whole, and particularly in the likes of the steel sector, or the use in decarbonising hydrogen, for example. So, the reason that HSBC is so supportive of the Carbon Capture and Storage Institute work is that it really helps us to get that better picture of what industry is truly doing.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Zoe. That's great. Let's move on to the next general question here. So CCS is increasingly being recognized as an essential tool to enable net zero emissions. How does CCS feature within the longer term decarbonisation strategy of your respective organisations? And I'll ask that question initially to Torbjørg.
Yes, thank you. Well, we have ambition of becoming climate neutral by 2050. And that means that we will have to remove the same amount of CO2 from the atmosphere as is emitted from the use of a product. And to achieve this, CCS hydrogen and renewable projects, they are all essential. And we regard CCS and hydrogen as complementary to renewable. In terms of hydrogen and CCS, we are approaching those markets that cannot be solved with renewable solutions alone. So we are approaching, heavy industries, clean, flexible power, maritime transport, as has been mentioned here before. And I would say that on a general basis, we are pursuing CCS along 3 pathways. One of them is to decarbonize our own emissions from oil and gas, and then CCS as an enabler for hydrogen business. And then thirdly, it's this CCS future standalone business, which really Northern Lights is all about, to offer a service to industry that want to decarbonize. And Northern Lights has really given us a lot of learning and also a lot of confidence that such a market will develop. And we believe that the most important now is projects to happen, because these projects, they are so important. They will help to shape and develop the commercial and the regulatory framework, the incentives, and they will pave the way for CCS and hydrogen to scale up, and cost reduction can then be achieved following the scale and the learning curve. So that is why our focus is on delivering projects more than anything else.
That's great. Thank you very much, Torbjørg. And Jamie, how does CCS fit within LafargeHolcim's decarbonisation strategy?
Well, I'd easily say it's fundamental. Last fall, we committed to net zero at Climate Week. And I would say, though, we didn't start the journey just last fall, luckily. It's a journey that this industry has been on for some time. We've been working to reduce our carbon footprint for many years. Getting to net zero means, though, that carbon capture is absolutely necessary. We produce both process and combustion emissions. The process emissions are what we call fact-of-life emissions. So the main product that we use to make cement is limestone, which is CaCO3. And as we heat up limestone, we need free lime in our process, and that drives off of CO2. So the mere function of making cement, we make CO2. So in order to get to net zero, we will have to have carbon capture in order for that to happen. So we can reduce our footprint through energy consumption, reducing our energy consumption, using alternative fuels, using renewable energy, using replacements for cements, or finding novel cements and things like that. But in the end, we will still use or need cementitious products, and we will still use limestone to make them. So having carbon capture available to us will be just fundamental to reaching our goals of net zero in the end.
Absolutely. Excellent. We know that cement is fundamental to growth around the world as we build new cities, likewise steel, and these are we know industries that emit a lot of CO2 that need CCS. So thank you. Vianney, how does CCS feature within the decarbonisation strategy of Air Liquide?
Yes, Guloren said it's not either or, but and I think that fits perfectly well with our own strategy. CCS is one of the pathways, but certainly not the only pathway. There are many pathways. I think we cannot afford to choose. We have to do many different things, and it's also true for hydrogen. We have mentioned a lot of hydrogen, and that's true. CCS will enable to get large quantities of low carbon hydrogen to foster the development of the hydrogen economy. And we always like to take, but it's not exclusive, and it's certainly not an excuse not to engage actively and seriously into green hydrogen. And at Air Liquide, we are contemplating both pathways. We are starting one of the largest new generation of electrolyzers in Canada, 20 megawatt. Yeah, it's not to play, it's to engage actively into the two main pathways for hydrogen. But we have to recognize as well the question of timing and a question of phasing. I always like to take the example that if we take one initiative like Northern Light, let's say 5 million tons, if you want to produce that quantity of hydrogen that through blue hydrogen would produce or would avoid 5 million tons of CO2, you would need to build a wind farm of 11 gigawatts. So you would need to mobilize the equivalent of the entire wind offshore program of a country like the Netherlands, and we know that Netherlands is one of the front runner in wind energy. So do we wait that all this capacity is available and low cost to engage into low carbon hydrogen? I think the answer is no, we cannot wait. So we have to engage in both, knowing the constraints in terms of cost and in terms of speed of getting enough renewable energy to get where we want on the long term. So that's really either it's an end-to-end strategy, and also I have to say that we have, of course, other activities on the hydrogen. At Air Liquide, we produce industrial gases that are energy-intensive activities like oxygen and nitrogen and rare gases. And for this, we are buying a lot of electricity, so we are actively engaging into buying renewable energy and supporting developers through PPAs, and a lot of this has been published and will hopefully be complemented by other announcements this year. So it's a very broad and complementary strategy for energy transition.
Excellent. Thank you, Vianney. We're certainly seeing that more and more organizations are seeing CCS as a fundamental part of their decarbonisation strategy and indeed their business strategies moving forward. So, Zoe, we'll turn to your views from the finance community. Considering decarbonisation, how is CCS being viewed within the finance community?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think I sort of alluded to this earlier, that there's a little bit of a trickiness in how investors think about CCS. So if I touch a bit more concretely on the numbers related to green finance products, so year to date we've had 500 billion of issuance of green bonds, well, green and sustainability linked bonds. Now, that's fantastic, but going back to the point of industry, and an industry representing around 30% of global emissions, financing that transition is where the opportunity lies for investors, but they're not quite sure how to go about it. In terms of banks specifically, we're all thinking about what our own net zero goals look like, and HSBC put out a commitment at the beginning of October that had an overarching ambition to help deliver a net zero economy, and do that three ways: by becoming a net zero bank, i.e. worrying about our operations, but more importantly, thinking about our finance submissions, and this is where this category fits into the thinking. It's how do we assess the risk profile of the loans that we've got outstanding in relation to climate factors. You know, how are those underlying companies going to be managing their own business models to take account of climate risk and adapting to the strategy? And also, how much of the finance submissions are we provisioning through that capital allocation? So the banks in particular are having to think of the way that they finance activities in a slightly different way. And so that's why we need to understand more about where it all fits in. Now, the EU taxonomy that has been worked on over the last 3 years or so is really helping with that, because that taxonomy classifies carbon capture and storage and gives various carbon intensity thresholds associated with activities to be able to help investors really categorize where the activity fits in on the scale of transition. So, you know, there's a whole variety of different things going on across both the asset owner, asset manager community, as well as the banks, and all eyes are focusing on COP26 next year because of the idea of having a finance element so intrinsically linked with the climate talks next year. So, in short, there's a lot going on, but there's a lot more that we can do to get better at telling the world how CCS fits into company strategies. And listening to my fellow panelists talk about what they're doing, it is hugely insightful to help us take this topic forward.
Absolutely. So I think it's really interesting within the Institute to observe just how much more dialogue we are starting to have with the finance community. I think we see the finance community showing much more interest in energy transition and technologies such as CCS. So it's an exciting time.
That's
lovely. Absolutely, excellent. And indeed, Zoe, you alluded to this recently in one of my final questions here. Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor and the the UN's special envoy for climate action and finance, has said that net zero transition represents the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. So I'm interested in hearing from the panel regarding what business models they see emerging to support CCS deployment around the world. And I'll ask that question initially to Vianney, if you could talk a little around that.
Yes, I think the first slide of Guloren, which I had not seen before, so to be very honest, I was very happy to see that you were referring to a cluster and hubs, not only to hydrogen, but also to cluster and hubs. And I think that's a key, that's a fundamental aspect. The projects that we are developing in priority are projects developed in consortium mode, in a collaborative approach, and in cluster and in hubs, in particular in Antwerp or in Rotterdam. If we look the example of Antwerp, it's very clear. It's not one company alone that can engage into that journey. It has to be done on a cluster basis. There are obvious many reasons that you have mentioned, economies of scale, and we have gone through a pre-FEED and all this, so we know exactly what we are talking about in terms of economies of scale, and it goes down very quickly. That's clear. The costs go down very quickly when you mutualize infrastructure, and also sharing the risk. Of course, there is always this question of a little bit chicken and egg, how to kickstart an infrastructure when maybe not companies can start at the same time, and this is natural. So we have to be, I would say, a little bit creative in order to find solutions to kickstart infrastructure at a scale or in a scalable concept, with the right balance, of course, between over-investing at the beginning, but that is fit for the long term while enabling kickstart. And that's really the point where we are in particular in Antwerp, with our other colleagues of the consortium that are well known. And the second aspect I'd like to emphasize on the business model is certainly the necessity to look for a network of CCS in Europe. And this is where we are certainly engaging now into a new area. CCS has been developed up to now on the point-to-point, as was mentioned, but also inter-country basis within Norway or within Canada or within the US. And now, are we going to succeed to make it cross-border? That's a challenge. Mm-hmm. That's a challenge. Cross-border, cross-companies, with contract in place, a fair sharing of costs, especially at the beginning. Mm-hmm. That would certainly require some reasonable behavior of everybody, to put it like this, and joint efforts. So if we want to make it happen, yeah, we have to work together at cluster level, at different sink, to have a network of sinks, and also find a way in challenging economic environment to make it happen. And that's certainly in the interest of everybody, but it needs a dialogue, for sure.
Excellent. Vianney, I think you raise a great point about the nature of clusters. We are starting to see more and more international clusters. And when we think about policy, when we think about regulation, that also needs to be international in nature in some instances. So that's great. Thank you. Jamie, what business models do you see emerging around CCS there in the US?
Yeah, so there's a lot of novel and innovative new products that are coming out, just because of the need to consume our own CO2, especially through mineralization. So in the building products industry, concrete itself actually consumed CO2 throughout its life, right? So through the carbonation process, which is literally just the mineralization of CO2. So we're seeing some promising technologies out there where people are taking, crushed concrete, old crushed concrete, and actually, putting it in contact with CO2 in the right atmosphere, and it's actually creating more aggregates and such. And then these products can be used back in concrete, and so we're seeing actually the consumption of CO2 in it. We're actually also engaged with a company named Solidia, producing a cement that in its curing process actually utilizes CO2. So it doesn't harden like the normal concrete. It actually needs CO2 to harden. This has actually kind of created a little bit of a chicken and an egg that was mentioned earlier, where there really isn't CO2 on the market for us to utilize for this product. So that's where we've engaged with a partner with Liquide to look at actually making it fully circular, where we can capture the CO2 as we make Solidia cement and then sell it alongside the cement and use it to cure the concrete. So some exciting things that I think that are happening with that. And I think that we'll start to see more innovative type products come up where we can, start to utilize our CO2 in the construction industry, actually after it's captured off of our plant.
Excellent. So Jamie, are you starting to see really a market for low carbon cement products developing there in the background?
Well, I think it's been a long road for the construction industry. I started with Holcim 20 years ago, and at that time, we were really starting to push the use of supplementary cementitious materials, low carbon cements and blended cements and things like that. And I think really now we're starting to, people are opening their eyes and starting to look for them. So that market is starting to grow. And truly, when you look at more so, we look at the large procurers like the government, right? The government, 40% of cement goes into infrastructure. So if we can get our governments to start to push the use of low carbon cements, that's where we can really start to see the use of them grow and the demand grow overall for the market as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's turn to Torbjørg. So if you could just talk a little about some of the business models that you're seeing emerging around CCS. Really interested to hear more about things like Northern Lights, where Equinor is potentially storing for third parties. That's a really interesting development.
Yeah, and there is actually quite a lot of learning from Northern Lights. I mean, when we talk to the different industry, we also get better insight in what is driving their projects. And what we have learned is that carbon pricing is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only one. It's really a combination of drivers, such as voluntary ambitions of climate reduction, also customers willing to pay for a low carbon product, and also public procurement of low carbon products. So it's really a combination of what we see. I would also like to give an example from another project than the Northern Lights project. It's a German project that we are looking into together with ThyssenKrupp Steel and evaluating the opportunity to use blue hydrogen as a reduction agent in the steel making, replacing coal. So, of course, if ThyssenKrupp Steel can replace coal with hydrogen, that can dramatically reduce their emission. But it would also increase the cost of the steel, obviously, and it would become like twice as expensive. However, this steel ends up, like as an example, in a passenger car. And 1 ton of steel in a passenger car increased the price of that car with around 200 euro. And that's not a lot. So I think quite a few would be willing to pay 200 euro for a car if you knew it was made of a clean product. So I think such markets are starting to exist and definitely can evolve. But in general, I would say that the development of business model will rely on all of us. It's really a massive collaboration across and together. It's industry and energy companies, it's citizens, it's the finance community, and it is the government. So all these going together, collaborating together is really key.
Excellent. And presumably in that ThyssenKrupp example, fundamental to the blue hydrogen production would be a technology such as CCS to deal with the CO2, to store the CO2 that is produced. Excellent.
Yeah, exactly.
Torbjørg, can I ask you just in terms of Equinor in general, presumably you see a potential market for handling CO2 for these third-party emitters growing in Europe and I guess potentially worldwide.
Yeah, definitely. So that's one of the key learning from Northern Lights. I mean, we've mapped that there are like 300 million tons of CO2 in Europe that are in reach for our storage facilities, and we see the interest from the industry. So we definitely think that there could be a market, but still, I mean, showing an interest to realizing a project, it's not a walk in the park. It will need, I mean, the first projects, they will need some funding schemes, but we think there will be a market, and perhaps the first phase will be, you know, a regulated market because it is state subsidies. But looking beyond that, we think also other models can evolve.
Excellent. Well, we're excited to see how those various projects develop, Torbjørg. Zoe, what enablers are required by the finance community to provide the capital that's needed for additional deployment of CCS? We've heard today about the need to scale up CCS deployment, and obviously there are various projects in the background that are progressing, moving forward. What does the finance community need?
Yeah, so I think what today has told us is that actually there are projects that are quite a long way down the line in terms of viability and actually are already being operationalized, as it were. I think what's the challenge going forward is commercializing everything else and really identifying the clusters where it makes sense for everybody to collaborate and get involved, and that will de-risk projects so that it brings finance along more effectively and makes the whole sort of emerging infrastructure around CCS a lot more sort of viable, and we can accelerate the collaboration and build from the learnings of everybody and all of that great stuff. I think, you know, the other enabler for the finance industry as a whole is getting a lot more of our risk colleagues involved with the companies that we're already servicing to understand how those projects are going to work. Because what we can sometimes find is that there's a bit of a bottleneck when, you know, the finance application goes through and the structuring starts getting in progress, and then there's a risk committee somewhere that may not be as advanced in their understanding of the particular state of the technology, if it's, for example, attached to hydrogen, or if it's in a cluster, or how it's all going to work. And that can slow the whole process down and maybe means that things aren't really getting priced properly because the risk isn't being taken into account accurately. So I think that will change very quickly because of the efforts that we've talked about in the financial system. So the taxonomy, also the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is encouraging companies to report on how they're addressing climate risks. So all of that coming together will really speed up the flow of finance into these projects. But that said, you know, it does need to happen a lot quicker. So all of us here are working on how we can really do that, how we can get this message out to a wider audience, how we can demonstrate that there is commercial viability in different activities. And also the most important thing for the finance community is demonstrating this CO2 avoidance, or the impact of benefit that the project's bringing to the climate debate.
Excellent. Zoe, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I think we have to end our panel discussion there. I would just like to say, Jamie, Zoe, Torbjørg, Vianney, thank you so much for the insight that you have shared today, and also for your leadership in helping with CCS deployment around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. So if I could have the final slide, please. Okay, so we've reached the end of our launch event today. Thank you very much for joining us. You can download a copy of the Global Status of CCS 2020 report from the Institute's website, www.globalccsinstitute.com. We will be making a recording of today's webinar available through the website in the coming days. If you'd like to learn more about the latest CCS activities, you can follow the Institute on social media through LinkedIn or Twitter. To learn more about Institute membership or our consultancy capabilities, please email us using info@globalccsinstitute.com. In closing, I'd just like to again thank all of our speakers today, and I'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining us and for your interest in CCS. We look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.